And that split second, I had to make my decision whether I was going to be true to myself. I was the first openly gay Lord Mayor, and the fact that there may be some people out there that don't want to have a gay Lord Mayor. For me, permanent visibility is permanent acceptance. And, I don't like the idea of rainbow washing your logo just because it suits you, just because you feel that you're doing the right thing.
This is the Public Sector Executive Podcast, bringing you views, insight and conversation from leaders across the public sector. Presented by Dan Benn.
Today I'm joined by Austin-Behan. Carl served as Lord Mayor of Manchester from 2016 until 2017. For 5 years before that, he was Labour Councillor for Burnage and is now working for the LGBT Foundation. Carl makes some really important points in this episode. Unfortunately, the connection wasn't the greatest, however, it's definitely still worth you sticking around and listening to it. So, Carl, thank you for joining me.
No problem. Good to be here.
So, tell us about your background.
So, I grew up in Crumsall, North Manchester. I ended up leaving school at the age of 16 with 1 GCSE in drama. Enjoyed school, but just wasn't very good at it. I knew from a very early age that I was possibly gay. But again, when I tried to tell my mum about it, it was very much a case of it's a phase you're going through. I spent a lot of time in my early years at sort of Boys Brigade as a way of sort of mixing with other people and mixing with other people my own age and stuff. So, yeah, I ended up just leaving school at 16, doing some random sort of jobs. And at the age of 17 and a half, I went over to see my brother, who was in the Air Force. And I realised there was a fire service there. And I'd always wanted to be a fireman. But in Greater Manchester at the time, you had to be 21 and they weren't recruiting. So when I came back from my criteria, I applied to the RAF and it took me 18 months. And I hadn't told anyone I was going into the Air Force. I didn't want being gay to define me because I felt that it was about who I was and about what I can do as a person. So I didn't want that to sort of stop me. So I joined up in April 1991, did my basic training at Austin-Behan, then went to Manston, then I went to Belize in Central America, and then I ended up going to Henlow in Bedfordshire. From there, did quite a lot of charity work, did quite a lot of marathons, did a lot of running, and then went to the Central Island. While I was out there, did a lot with combined service entertainment. Came back after 9 months, went to Huntington. But then in April of 97, the lad that I'd started seeing, he actually told the Air Force that I was gay. And I was then taken into obviously personal services flight with a padre, which is a vicar, and also with the RAF police. And they just sat me down and just said, "You have homosexual tendencies." And that split second, I had to make my decision whether I was going to be true to myself. And this was the moment where I could be all lying. I think if I'd have said no, I think the Air Force would have been like, "Thank you very much. We just had to ask." They asked again and I burst into tears. So I think that was when they realised the fact that, I was. And then literally they told me that I am now no longer serviced to requirements. I'm incompatible to service life. It was very much a case of I was suspended then for 6 months while they did all the paperwork. And I challenged it. I wrote to Tony Blair. I wrote to various other members within the Parliament and within the MOD, all of which just came back and said that, being a homosexual is not acceptable in the Air Force or in the armed forces. That was the sort of basis of being kicked out of the Air Force. I then ended up working in Asda. But at the same time, I'd been applying to Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. I managed to get in on my own merit, and it was only once I got my contract that I told them that I was gay. And they turned around and were like, "Oh no, we don't have gays in the fire service. There are no gays." And then they told me not to tell the recruits that I was on the training course with. However, that lasted about 3 weeks. And then I ended up telling the recruits, which then caused the fire service issues because they then needed to know what they were supposed to do. Because they had no diversity and equality at the time, they ended up setting up a husband and wife team who happened to know someone who was gay, who then went round to the stations where I could be posted to tell them, "This is how you talk to a gay, this is how you act around a gay, this is how you are," which is all very bizarre considering that was only 1998. I stayed in the fire service for 18 months and do you know what? I joined for the wrong reasons. I joined because I felt I'd let people down. I felt like I'd let my mum and dad down and everything. So that was why I joined up. I then in 1999 set up my own promotions company called Oz Promotions. And we managed to do the work for the Manchester Evening News, and we launched Metro in Manchester, and then that came out, Metro newspaper, and did that for about 10 years. But then in 2005, I was living in the city centre, found myself moaning about a lot of things like people parking in cycle lanes, the state of the bins, the state of the canal, how dirty it was, and all the litter and everything. And I was moaning to the council, and at the time, the council within the city centre weren't really doing much. So I thought, well, rather than moan about it, do something yourself. So I got involved in local politics, and I then in 2010 stood for Burnage in South Manchester. Missed out by 183 votes. Then in 2011, I got elected with a 1,600 majority. Whilst I was on the council, I was doing licensing. Ended up being lead member for cycling and lead member for gay men. Whilst I was there, I also realised that we have someone called the Lord Mayor who is supposed to represent citizens and represent everyone and be the first citizen of Manchester. And when I looked at the board in the town hall where I've got all the pictures of all the different Lord Mayors, it looked very stereotypical. There was a couple of females on there, and there was a couple of different faces. So I decided that wasn't representative of our city. So I put myself forward. And in 2015, I missed out by 1 point to Paul Murphy, who made an amazing Lord Mayor. And in 2016, I became the youngest, but also the first openly gay Lord Mayor of Manchester. And I say openly gay Lord Mayor because I know that the council didn't want to sort of mention that at first, because they didn't want people to question that, has there been a gay Lord Mayor that's just not been out before? And then in 2018, I ended up being deselected in the Labour Party in Burnage. I wasn't a massive fan of Jeremy Corbyn, but his policies were very good, but just not deliverable. And then in August of 2018, I was made an honorary doctorate from Bolton University for my services to LGBTQ plus communities. Then Andy Burnham, who'd just been made Mayor of Greater Manchester, asked me if I would lead on the Greater Manchester LGBT Action Plan as the LGBT advisor. And in September last year, I then became the Greater Manchester LGBTQ plus community ambassador as part of the LGBT Foundation.
So just to go back to your time as Lord Mayor of Manchester, so that was 2016 to 2017. How was that time?
When I first put myself forward, and then knowing that, I was the first openly gay Lord Mayor, and the fact that there may be some people out there that don't want to have a gay Lord Mayor win, especially when it comes to, if we talk about schools, when it comes to faith, when it comes to religion, people's own views and opinions could get in the way. However, I was completely blown away because I got invited to so many different events, because I didn't think that I'd be going to synagogues or temples or mosques. However, one thing that stood out was the fact that I think people realised that I'd gone with an agenda initially to promote diversity, equality and inclusion. But when we look at any group of people, there's going to be people there who are from the LGBTQ plus community who may have to keep it to themselves. They may not be out. They may be sort of having to live a life that I had to do between 1991 and 1997. So in a way, it made it a lot easier, because then it was more about just getting the conversation started. And I think that's what people actually liked. And I think that's where, especially when it came to faith and religion, they were quite happy to have that conversation and have that debate. And it also made it so it wasn't coming from them. It was an outside speaker having that conversation.
Absolutely. And kind of calling back to what you said about when you looked at the board of the Lord Mayors and there wasn't as much representation on there. Do you think that's one thing that's changed?
So when I was Lord Mayor, I made a point that I wasn't going to wear the sort of pinstripe suit that you would normally wear. I was wearing now, I'm going to wear my my bright colours and wearing the suits that I want to wear and do it that way. And what was also great is that there's now a lot more people within the LGBTQ plus community who are now standing as either civic mayors or mayors around other parts of the country. I didn't mention it in the opening ceremony. I was Mr. Gay UK in 2001. And it's about the fact that, going from Mr. Gay UK to being Lord Mayor in 15 years shows how much progress we've made in such a short time. As long as you've got the willpower, you've got the, you get the determination, anyone can be Mayor or Lord Mayor.
Absolutely. So obviously your time as Labour councillor in Burnage, what kind of achievements did you get when you were councillor there, and how did you impact the community in the best way that you could?
I felt that Burnage was very much for me, and it had a majority of 1,500, and I then just spent about 18 months, because it was a fellow year, of building that, of knocking on, going doors, doing all the leaflet rounds, making sure everyone got the Christmas cards. So I really worked the ward, and I did it for 18 months. And then, as I say, lost out on the election by just 183 votes. I continued the work week in, week out, which then gave me a 1,600 majority. And as I say, I love the ward I represent. I still end up putting in, even now, the council still get bits of casework from me when I'm moaning about litter, or I'm moaning about lights not working, or bus shelters smashed in. I moved to Burnage from Beetham Tower to represent the ward, and I'm still proud to live in the ward.
Definitely. I think that's so important from my point of view as well, being, like you said there, that you moved to Burnage to represent that community. I think that's so important, that you're not just some voice, some person who represents the community from afar.
And that's one thing I've always said. I said, if this is the same for every councillor and for every MP. You should have to live in the ward that you represent. One of the reasons why I ended up losing my seat was because we had a boundary review in 2018. I do get frustrated when you've got councillors in wards representing or living in a ward but representing somewhere else. When, I used to see firsthand on my way into work in the morning, if I was going to the gym at 6:30, I was actually seeing, bins that have been trashed, or bus shelters that have been broken, or, things that you'd want to report. I was able to deal with that before some people had even got out of bed. But you can't do that when you're not living in the ward.
You mentioned there seeing stuff when you were going to the gym, like before people even woken up. Those people who knew that you were the councillor, that you lived there, do you think that helped build a more of a relationship with the residents in the community as well?
Probably more so then, because it was more a case of building that relationship and getting a relationship. Over the last few years, I think we've become very much, I think most people have now got some understanding of local government than what we used to have. I think more people have become a bit more understanding of what elections are and who their local representatives are. But also, I think people realise that actually, you can challenge your councillors. Yes, you can get in touch with them. I've got mates who mentioned something to me about they've got something going on in their apartment block, or they've got something going on in their local green or something like that. I'm like, have you informed your councillors? And they're not aware. Some of them aren't aware that they can actually, your councillors are there to serve you. So, they put themselves in that situation to do that. So use them for it.
Definitely. So just to move on and to call back a little bit, when you talk about your background and you mentioned your time in the RAF, I just want to touch on LGBTQ plus rights in the workplace.
Yeah.
So obviously one example is your time in the RAF, when what you went through, when you mentioned that you had to live a double, triple life. Do you think that now that the LGBT community is more on terms with people who aren't necessarily in the community than they were before?
Because of the way that a lot of organisations have now moved on, I think that they also realise that they've got to treat the LGBTQ plus community in their workforce with respect. And also, we've now got things like LGBT History Month, which we never used to have. We've now got Pride Month, which we never used to have, that everyone knows about. It does frustrate me sometimes, because I'd rather if you're a business in an organisation, bringing people in to do a talk, which is great, but it doesn't have to just be during LGBT History Month or Pride Month. It can be any time in the year, because for me, permanent visibility is permanent acceptance. And, I don't like the idea of rainbow washing your logo just because it suits you, just because you feel that you're doing the right thing. You have to be doing the right thing because it's what you truly believe in and not just ticking a box. There's a lot of organisations out there that, can do training and can sort of give advice. And I think that that's where some businesses should go to, rather than just relying on just what they can see themselves. And I think there's a lot of businesses and organisations now that have LGBTQ plus networks. I think in the workplace, I think it's got a lot better for people. And there's still a lot of people out there that don't feel comfortable to be out themselves. And I think as an employer or anyone within the workplace, you need to let people be themselves, because you're only going to get the best out of them if they can be their true authentic self.
100%. I totally agree with you. And just to kind of zoom in a little bit more on kind of the points you've just made, do you think that the equality that's getting better, do you think that's also reflected in the public sector?
I'd probably say the equality that's getting better, I'd probably say is probably better in the public sector than the private sector. More so because I think the public sector understand the equalities and understand the rules and regulations better than the private sector. Because I think there's some people in the private sector turn a blind eye to a lot of things just because it doesn't affect them, especially depending what trade you're doing. I mean, a brilliant example for, let's say, for the private sector in that way is an organisation like Building Equality. They'll only work with suppliers or work with anyone within their supply chain who has got LGBTQ plus policies, trans policies, to make sure that works. And I think that's unique within the private organisation.
Just to move on a little bit to, obviously, your role at the LGBT Foundation, how does that make a real difference to people's lives?
The role that I was doing for Andy Burnham had finished after 4 years. And basically, I think one thing that was important that the foundation realised and know is the fact that within the whole of Greater Manchester, we're looking at around about 215,000 people identify as LGBTQ. But there's no one actually just doing one set of work in any one of the 10 boroughs. So a lot of the work that I was doing, it was a lot about collaboration. It was a lot about networking. It was a lot about working up with connections, and also about community action. I set up a newsletter when I first did this role. That now goes out to over 2,000 people across Greater Manchester. It then gets reshared within their networks. It goes to every councillor across Greater Manchester. So it's about sharing knowledge and about sharing information within Greater Manchester, but also within Manchester itself. I reset up the Village Action Forum, which is part of what the LGBT Foundation wanted to do. It was about making sure it was clean, tidy space. It was a safe space. And as we know, a few years ago, there was the Manchester City Council had the regeneration framework to look at the work going on around the village, as it were, but missed the vital point of calling it the wrong name. And so it's about the fact of sort of making sure that some of these things are just picked up on. Greater Manchester is the only place in the country that has a Pride parade or Pride event that takes place in all of its boroughs. And for Manchester itself, we also have Levenshulme, Didsbury, Chorlton, Whalley Range, Levenshulme Pride separately. And I've set up the Greater Manchester Pride Network. So they're all working together and to promote and enhance the life of LGBTQ plus people and make it about family safe spaces. So a lot of it, again, going with that was the connections that I've got with councillors, with council officers across Greater Manchester, then also public sector. And one thing we mentioned in before was the fact that, when you said about public sector, the private sector do a lot of great things, so the public sector and so the third sector, but no one joins them up together very well. So it's about sort of connecting them and bringing them together when we set up a big networking group. So we now got the LGBT sort of network for all people to come together from different organisations. That includes NHS, GMCA, fire service and the police, and ensuring that work takes place across all the 10 boroughs. And I say the networking makes a massive difference because it gets people talking. And then another thing that I've been sort of doing is looking at fundraising, but then that's fundraising across all different specters, all different formats. So it's a complete mixed bag, really, of what I get involved in. My problem is I never say no, which doesn't give me much time, but it's it's what I enjoy doing. And one thing I will say is, like, when I said at the beginning about being gay and going into the Air Force, and I said that I didn't want being gay to define me. I think because of being kicked out of the Air Force and what I've done, it ended up defining me.
Do you think that now that obviously you said then that it has ended up defining you, but do you think that's more positive way that
Absolutely.
You're glad that it does now?
Yeah, because I'd have probably been one of them people where I've never been one to shy away from sort of having a conversation. Never been one to sort of shy away from that. I think just because of the fact that the way that I was treated and the way that I was kicked out from the Air Force just because I was gay and that I could have gone to prison. I think when I took stock of it all and when I actually thought about it, that's what gave me the fire in my belly to become an LGBTQ plus activist and also an ally of all other communities.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I think that's a really good place for us to end. So thank you for joining me, Carl.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to the latest podcast from Public Sector Executive Magazine. Don't forget to like and subscribe to make sure you receive every new edition.